Welcome back to Unlapped. Unfortunately for our listeners, I'm not Katie George, I'm Laurence Edmondson. But the good news is I've got Nate Saunders, as always, joining me, and our friend and guest, Spencer Hall. I say guest, but actually I think he's been on the last two podcasts in Las Vegas, so soon becoming a regular, I feel, Spencer Hall with us as well. The plan for today, and it's a pretty big plan, is to get through a review of the 2023 Formula One season now that it's officially over. As we've known for several months, Max Verstappen is our world champion, his third championship in a row. Red Bull got their second consecutive Constructors' Championship, but there was a huge amount of fighting for lower positions behind that. So we're going to do our best to break it all down and reflect on some of the most incredible moments that we saw over the 2023 season. Now, remember, this is a bit I've been wanting to say for a while now. If you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave a comment, whatever that may be. And don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. If you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. All right, gentlemen, let's get into it. Nate, Spencer, season is officially over. As I said before, I think the last time we were all together was in Las Vegas. But what have you two been up to since? I believe you actually met up in Atlanta.
We did. We got our boy his southern exposure and took him on a little tour of Atlanta, showed him a couple of places where a bunch of bad things happened, and then got him some barbecue and football. So really, he got the full slate.
Yeah, it was awesome. So I stayed in Vegas, as you know, Laurence. Went to Thanksgiving in Tampa, and then went to Atlanta for the SEC Championship game. Just an awesome trip all around. And when I saw Spencer, I had a beard that wasn't quite as big as his, but was about half the size. And to sum up the state I was in when I got home, in my jet lag state, trying to stay awake, I took my razor out, went to shave my beard, and had left the key bit of the razor off, which dictates the length of it. So I feel like a new man, but I feel like quite a bit of an egghead today. So I don't know whether I'm going to be an egghead in terms of the content of my output, but we'll see. But yeah, it was a great time, and I've got to say, shout out to the people of Atlanta, because some of the friendliest people I've met have been down there. It was a cool place. Went to the Coca-Cola Museum as well, and they've won me over. I used to, float between them and Pepsi, but I'm all in on Coke now.
Good to hear. For those listening on a podcast, I do urge you to get yourself onto YouTube to watch the video format of this, just to see Nate's beautiful face. I haven't seen him look like that for some time. I'm not sure his mother's seen him look like that for some time.
I just sent a picture to my parents, and they were both found it very funny. My mum said, "You should keep it." And I said, "There's absolutely no way this is happening." But if you do watch it on YouTube, you'll see my dimples the whole way through, which are absolutely massive, I found out.
Good dimples. Right, okay, let's go on this, because we do have, as I said, an awful lot to get through. The story of the 2023 season, as we know, it was about Max Verstappen dominating, breaking multiple records. We'll get to all that in a bit. But first of all, way to ease us in. If you take Max aside, gentlemen, who are your top 3 drivers? I'm going to start with Nate.
Yeah, so this was something that I thought was going to be a lot easier than it was. I think my top 3, I guess we'll list them and then discuss, right? So I would say Alonso, Lando Norris, and Alex Albon, which I appreciate is controversial. There's no Lewis in there, but we can discuss.
Spencer?
I was going to take Piastri. I was going to take Alonso, and I was going to take Albon. So there's a little bit of overlap there, but I agree with Nate. It is a much harder task than I anticipated, picking the top 3 most impressive drivers.
And no Valtteri Bottas from you, Spencer.
No, Valtteri. Listen, you have to be honest with those you love. I love Valtteri. He wasn't a top 3. He wasn't a top 12 driver this year.
No, I think that's probably fair. Maybe Valtteri would even admit that himself. I actually had the same written down on my notepad here as Nate. If you go to ESPN's website, sooner or later you'll find my top 10 list. And it's slightly different, but I really wanted to include Albon as well, just because of the remarkable job that he did in that Williams. And I think that's the thing that is so difficult to do when we do these kind of lists, when we talk about who really impressed us, is to remove the car element and focus on what the driver achieved themselves. I want to pick up on Piastri, Spencer, because it's a good shout. What was it about him, obviously in his rookie year, that really stood out to you?
I think the most difficult thing for a rookie to deal with week in and week out is the mental element of racing and learning to be a professional at that level. and really dealing with the stress and being consistent. And especially towards the second half of the season, Piastri was icy, was composed, was as consistent and bankable an element as we had outside of the Max Verstappen reality distortion field. So it was thrilling for me to see a young driver do that well, that consistently, and without an ounce of insecurity in either direction. He just seemed like he belonged. It wasn't like he was a destabilizing or overly competitive force on his own team, nor was it like he wanted to take a back seat to Lando. That's impressive. That kind of composure is unique, and I thought he deserved a shout out for that alone.
Yeah, I think you're right, Spence. I mean, Andrea Stella, the team principal at McLaren, pointed out that he reminded him of Fernando Alonso and Michael Schumacher, two of the drivers that Stella's worked directly with, and arguably two of the best drivers of the last.
Seems like a fine comparison.
Yeah, you can't get much better praise than that, really, can you?
Nate, just quickly on I did a bit on Albon. So on Norris and Alonso, what was it about those two?
Yeah, well, I mean, Spencer makes a really good point about Piastri. And I actually, in thinking about this, I was thinking Piastri had such a good year. You also had in the context that he was a rookie, and you don't quite expect as much from rookies. The reason I put Lando in there, I felt like one of the McLaren drivers had to be in that, non-max top three. The reason I put Lando there was because I think over the course of the year, he was just so good. Now he made a few mistakes by his own admission in qualifying, which I think it was two at least where he felt like pole position was there. But I think given how far ahead Max was all year, I don't think those mistakes really had a huge bearing on his season. They were still mistakes, but I think that what we saw from Lando, especially given, if you remember, I mean, Laurence, you'll remember this when we were in Bahrain, his body language at the start of the year, just given where McLaren was and given, he was staring down the barrel at another year of McLaren just being 15th every week, which was awful. The way he grew into that season as the car got better, I think was really impressive. So that's why I gave him the nod. And Alonso, I mean, just fantastic all year. I mean, I know as the car fell away a bit, he was less prominent at the top, but he actually, if you look at his performances, he was just always there, the level of excellence that he set. I mean, at the start of the season, he was really what was making it interesting behind Max, wasn't he? It was that tantalizing thought of Fernando could win a race. We've said Monaco, where it felt like for a few laps it was close. And it was just great as well as Formula One fans. We've seen Alonso, he's been through the ringer for quite a while in terms of the cars he's driven, the opportunities that he's kind of missed out on. So for things to for him to have made a career move that, seemingly went in a positive direction rather than in a negative one was nice as well. And yeah, I think there's nothing better than a happy Alonso, but also a competitive Alonso. I think it's just great to see. So I think he was comfortably at the top of this pack. And I have to say, and we can talk about this, but I feel really harsh leaving Hamilton out, because I think, again, with Hamilton, I think we expect so much of him that a season like he had, you're like, yeah, of course Hamilton was good. Like he's a 7-time world champion. So I think you can almost downplay the year he had because we know what he's capable of doing. So I would caveat that by saying that Hamilton could be in there, but it's like you said, Laurence, it's so tricky when you've got 3 spaces, because there's about 6 or 7 people that you feel like could have had a shout to be in there. How about you? Because you said yours were the same as mine. So was there any differences on kind of Albon, Lando, or anything like that from what I said?
Well, the other way I think we can justify our Alonso and Norris choices is that they got the most podiums behind the 2 Rebel drivers. So Alonso with 8 over the season, Lando Norris with 7. And when I was going through my top 10 and writing it up, I did some maths on Lando Norris's season. And of course, it only really got started from Austria onwards, which is when McLaren brought a huge upgrade to their car. And if you zeroed the points in Austria and allowed them to amount from that point onwards, then Lando Norris would have been second in the championship to Max Verstappen, ahead of Sergio Perez, ahead of Lewis Hamilton, ahead of Fernando Alonso, ahead of the Ferrari drivers. So that really underlines what a great job Norris did during that period. The only thing going against him is that I think there were a few occasions where he admits that he didn't get the best from it. There was at least 3 pole positions that he could have got. Qatar was one, USA, and the final one has escaped me, but I'm sure we'll get back to it when we get around to McLaren. So yeah, 3 times he said he felt he could have been on pole position if it wasn't for his own mistake. So that kind of counts against him. But I think, I personally think that those are very justifiable. But as you say, you could make arguments for so many of the drivers on the grid this year being in that group behind Max. While we're on kind of more general subject, I want to get your most memorable moments of the year, and this time starting with Spencer.
I loved qualifying more this year than I think I have in any other season because the races in general were a foregone conclusion past the one spot. So at times, if you really wanted to see someone sweat, if you really wanted to see Max Verstappen put forth great effort and serious concentration in a moment where it had to matter, qualifying carried greater weight this year. And for me, qualifying at Monaco was legitimately thrilling. Like that's where we thought maybe Alonso was going to ride his resurgent wave of enthusiasm and 40 plus greatness into something like a win. And it was brilliant watching all of them attempt to top the other. And to do it at that circuit, to do it in that environment, it was just absolutely thrilling to watch. I know it wasn't the greatest season. I know it was lackluster in terms of drama, but it was still there. You can't beat speed for drama, and you can't beat speed in that setting with the stakes that Monaco's pole position carries. That for me, that was my favorite moment.
Yeah, that was particularly special, I have to say. Nate, for you?
Yeah, I mean, mine wasn't this, but I was thinking about Monaco because to cap it off was the Max lap at the end where it seemed like he was just going to drive straight into the wall and somehow missed it at the end. That was amazing. I think the only thing when I was thinking about it that stood out more for me than that, and it's going to sound like I'm on some Alonso fan show hype, but his battle with Sergio Perez at Interlagos, I thought that if you were to crystallize the best bits of Formula One and put them into a few laps, I think it was that. The only negative was it wasn't for the win. Other than that, it was brilliant, and again, I talked about, a happy and competitive Alonso. I think that for a lot of newer fans, especially, Alonso has been one of those people that they've heard about how great he is. They've heard about, oh, he's this, he's that, they hadn't until this year really had maybe they did in 21 of some of his Alpine drives, but that was a reminder that Alonso's not just quick, he's not just a guy who's consistent. He, as a racing driver, he ticks so many boxes. And Perez, to his credit, fought very, very cleanly as well. We saw Max and Lewis, nearly come to blows there a couple of years before. And yeah, it was just a really thrilling moment. And I think that it was it was at the same time brilliant, and it was frustrating because part of me watching it was like, man, this is for a fairly it was for, I think it was for third position. Maybe it was for second. I forget exactly what it was. And you thought, man, if this was the season we had, if this was for the win, obviously we got spoiled by 2021, then it would have been that much more thrilling. But yeah, as a handful of laps, I don't think we had better. And for Alonso to have probably done it in a car that was on pace, was not as quick as well, to have got it at the end, drag race to the line. I think there's few things better than that in a racing in a Grand Prix race.
Yeah, it was the third place, and actually it was on my list as well. Nate, I think we spent too much time together.
I think we do.
The impressive thing about that was, of course, that we had a car being overtaken and then re-overtake, which we rarely see in modern F1. But I'm going to go to second on my list, which was the Las Vegas battle. Three-way battle kind of over a number of laps for the lead between Checo, who kind of inherited it after a safety car, Leclerc, who was absolutely mega that day and was unlucky because of the safety car, and then, of course, the inevitable Max Verstappen, who went on to win it. But I think Vegas as a whole, quite a few of us were skeptical going into it. I don't think any of us expected the drama we saw on that first practice day, where a drain cover came loose and we didn't get any more running for about 6 hours. But a lot of us were skeptical about whether that racetrack would offer up decent racing. And it really did, and it was spectacular. So I'm going to stick Vegas in there, and with a special mention as well for, if we're talking about favourite moments. I don't believe they have to be all on the track. Was Bruce Buffer's introduction of Sergio Perez.
From Mexico, it's Sergio Perez.
And more than anything, really, Perez's reaction to it, which I'm not sure I've ever seen a driver look quite so bored. These guys are usually so confident, and there he was, just kind of staring into the camera, staring at Bruce Buffer, wondering what on earth he should do.
Yeah, that was, and we were laughing hysterically about that in the press room. And also from that same thing, I don't know if you saw, but when he introduced Charles, he said Charles in a weird way, and he'd written, I think he says Charles, and it actually on his notes when people zoomed in, he had written it phonetically as. So I think and apologies if I've got this wrong, but it was like Charles Leclerc, and he'd read it as that, and you can see Leclerc come out and it's like, that's not how, no one's ever pronounced it like that. So just all round, I thought that was great, and it's funny, isn't it? Because I think people criticize moments like that, but ultimately that was really entertaining. So I don't think you can't manufacture that again, but it just shows you, like, when things are live and things are big and bold like that, you're going to get funny moments. So yeah, I thought that was great.
I think if I had to butt in with another Vegas moment, and this is, I think the Vegas event itself had its own way of winning people over despite its absurdity, and that includes Max Verstappen. He spent the better part of the week being very honest and blunt about how much he was not enjoying anything and having a very bad time. And then I think, like dad on the last day of vacation, when he's had a few too many and things have gone right for him finally, him singing Viva Las Vegas over the mic on the victory lap, that's flawless. Like, the last person who couldn't be charmed by the race finally gave in only after he had won it, and they were piping Elvis into his headphones. So I adored that.
Yeah, that was it. I mean, that was I think the true arc of the Las Vegas race weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Finished with Verstappen actually really quite enjoying it. Okay, we've kind of been skirting around Max throughout this podcast so far. Let's talk about it, because I mean, the records are endless. I've got some written out in front of me here. 19 race wins in a season, that's a record. 21 podiums in a season, that's a record. Those two records were previously held by Max anyway. 12 wins from pole in a season, that's a record. 575 points is the most ever any driver has scored in a season. Of course, he got 10 consecutive race wins as part of that, 6 hat tricks, 290 points ahead of Sergio Perez, his teammate, so he more than doubled Perez's score. He would have finished second in the constructors by himself. 1,003 laps led. I didn't even know we had that many laps in a season. He's the only driver ever to go over 1,000 laps in a season. And that means a total of 75.7% of the total laps led by Max as well. I mean, those records kind of speak for themselves. But Spencer, I want to ask you, in the context of wider sports, I think Nate and I all too often have our head buried in Formula One and we don't look at other stuff. You have a much broader view of the sporting landscape. How do you contextualize this success by Max?
It is hard to contextualize because there's very few peers for this kind of explanation. You have to resort to the kind of grandiose comparisons that people begin to cringe at instantly because the names are so big, so cliched, and so obvious. It's like one of Messi's mega goal seasons. It's like one of these kind of induplicable, like distance running things where you go, oh my God, they ran a marathon in 2 hours. It is a Bob Beamon long jump in Mexico City at altitude, but you do it every single race for the entirety of an F1 season. It's Jeff Gordon 99 in NASCAR. It's the levels. It's Serena Williams. It's that kind of Michael Jordan style domination over the course of a whole season. It's hard to sum up what you couldn't compare him to when you just want to go ahead and say, okay, this is great. And I think people will put it on that level eventually. I think when they see the kind of, I think domination in F1 is not unusual. I think people know that. I think the lay fan knows that. I think they know there are long runs, but I do not think they properly understand the scale of this particular season, this particular run, and exactly how dominant he was. He was so dominant that he made a sport where you go 200 miles an hour in front of millionaires boring. That shouldn't be, and he was capable of it. So I think a lot of our criticisms of the 2023 season are in fact a backhanded compliment to the level of dominance. Whatever you want to throw on there in terms of it's incredible how dominant this person was, that's where he's at.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And you're so right. Every time we get records like this, you don't necessarily appreciate them at the time. I remember Lewis saying this a lot of the time after he'd broken records, is that he couldn't quite get his head around at the time. But then when you start to look back at it and you realize that the size of the achievement, it does become very clear. But Nate, the reality of living through 19 of 22 races won by Max Verstappen is quite different, isn't it? And as impressive as it is, and of course, Max is just doing what Max does, and he shouldn't be criticized in any way for it, nor should Red Bull. But the sport as a whole, does it face a bit of a problem here if we continue to have this level of domination?
Yeah, I think so. And like Spencer said, none of this is aimed at Max. This is just a fact of how things are. But yeah, I really think so. And I think it's very telling when you see the tail end of the season, so much hype, or, in my opinion, forced hype is being put on the battle for second, the battle for third, and the constructors, because ultimately it's hard to get excited about that. And I think that there is a tendency within the paddock to kind of try and make out like every season's been amazing. And looking at it, this one from a competitive point of view, there's been some good moments, as we talked about. But this season, especially towards the second half of the year, I think it dragged, because you knew Max was winning races. I mean, there was obviously Singapore where he didn't win, which was kind of, a nice kind of like, okay, there's a change and Ferrari's back on, top of the podium and stuff like that. But we're coming off of, we're in a period right now where Formula One's popularity is as high as it is. It's never been as big as this. It's never had the kind of the global appeal that it's got right now. And I feel like 2021 really has recalibrated what a good season is in Formula One, and that was so special. I'd be amazed if we ever got something that close again, certainly in the next couple of years. But this one, I think, is probably on the other end of the scale to that, and I think you can do both. Both things can be true. You can look at what Max did this year and say, unbelievable achievement, unbelievable domination. One of the all-time great individual seasons from Verstappen. But as a whole, I think one of the worst I've done as a journalist, and that includes some of those Lewis years. And I think the reason why as well, if you look at those Lewis years by comparison, the stats are actually that Lewis set, even though at the time it felt like he was dominating a lot. He wasn't winning as many races, wasn't leading as many laps. It felt like there was a lot more of a tangible chance he might not win races, whereas this wasn't the case this year. So if this continues into next season, and this is the other thing as well that I want to throw into this, if this continues into next year, I think there's two things that are kind of concerning. One is it's not fun to keep watching the same driver win. The other is, and we've talked about this before on the show, I know, is that this feels like one of the most talented grid lineups we've had for a very, very long time in Formula One. You've got Max, you've got Lewis, you've got Fernando, but beneath that, you've got all these young guys. You've got Charles, Lando, you've got Albon, you've got Russell, you've got Piastri coming through. And at the moment, those guys are just battling around for scraps behind Max. They're getting a second here. Lando still hasn't won a race. Russell's only won one race. Charles has won 5 races, I think it is, or 6 races. I can't remember exactly how much, but that's crazy when you look at, what Max is doing. And you almost have this fear that while fans might stop watching on the one hand because of how predictable it is, you've also almost got this generation of talent that potentially you're like, well, could these guys just go completely unfulfilled for a few years because they're not dominating, and then in a couple of seasons, 2026, we get these new rules. Will somebody else dominate and then just do the same? And if you're Lando or if you're Charles, you just get kind of just stuck in the wasteland there. And that would be from the point of view of being a fan of racing, I think that'd be really sad. And then obviously there's the viewing perspective and the audience as well. So I don't know if people are going to stop watching in droves, because I think Formula One's done a really good job of connecting with people beyond just the racing. But I think another season like this, and we'll start to see some really concerning things in terms of just how popular it is. But then again, we've all talked about it. Vegas seemed like a really big win for Formula One in terms of just some of the hype and some of the talk around that. So maybe it's less important in a sport like Formula One compared to maybe other sports where this would be damaging.
Now, one of the obvious reasons why we didn't have a competitive season was because the only other driver who got his hands on a car as good as the Red Bull, was of course Checo Perez, and he didn't perform at all. Now, Spencer, I'll come to you in a bit, but Nate, I know you've got some vaguely strong opinions on Perez. How do you summarize his season? Because it started well after the first 4 races. I think we would have all agreed that he was doing what he should be doing in that car, but then it just disappeared. Why?
Yeah, and that's ultimately one of the big frustrations is we got that glimpse of Perez. We knew coming into the year it was going to be Red Bull v Red Bull. And I don't know, it seems, and you've mentioned already the driver rankings that will be going live on Friday on ESPN.com/Formula One that Laurence has written. And in the Max bit, you rightly point out that he used Baku, which was Perez's second win, to analyze how he'd been struggling. He used that and it became a 10 race winning streak after that. The following race, I think, was Miami, wasn't it? Which is where Perez kind of meekly didn't really fight Max. And you never really felt, after Baku, you never really felt like there was fight in Perez. You never really felt like he had ultimately that extra ingredient that you need to fight somebody like Max. And we saw for all of the criticism and stuff of Nico Rosberg, the one thing you can say about him when he fought Lewis was he studied Lewis and he learned how to beat the guy. And I don't feel like with Perez, he's had that mental fortitude this year to do that. And when you're in a car as good as the Red Bull, you can't just win 2 races at the start of the year and then be happy to kind of cling on to second at the end of the season. I think looking at it, I know that Red Bull to their credit have tried to put their arm around Perez as much as possible. But I think in other seasons, if rivals were closer, I don't think he'd have kept the seat all season. I don't think there would have been any complaints from him or from fans of his if, say, after Monza that said, sorry, we're going in a different direction. And I think for Perez, ultimately, that's the big storyline going to next year. If Red Bull's rivals are closer, I feel like that kind of the hammer of Damocles or whatever they call it is kind of hanging over his head, because ultimately you can't be in Formula One and be performing like that in such a good car. And I think that Perez, you asked me what happened, Laz, and I think from talking to people at Red Bull, I think ultimately, and this is where you can kind of humanize it, and you can really feel for Perez. I think ultimately he was beaten in Miami, and then he made that mistake in qualifying in Monaco, and I think ultimately that just got in his own head. He started to overthink things. He started to make very small mistakes, which had a massive bearing, especially in qualifying. He would start to make these mistakes and he would be starting races way, way down the field, and he'd spend half the race fighting back and he'd get to third or second. So you knew if it had clean weekends, he probably could have been finishing second a lot more. And, I don't know what that spiral's like. I'm sitting here, on a nice comfy desk in my flat in Reading. I've never had to compete against a guy like Max Verstappen. So I'm not saying that I could have done it any better than him, but he's also paid that money to do that. And we didn't see Perez ultimately at the level mentally we needed him to be last year. So hopefully this offseason has come at a good time. He can get away from Formula One, rest up, get to where he needs to be and come back stronger next year. But I think the big thing for me next year is I would be surprised if Perez sees out the season with Red Bull if he's in that same form, because Red Bull just can't afford him to be dropping that many points if people are closer.
So one of the only for Perez fans, one of the only kind of silver linings that I saw towards the end of the year was a quote from the technical director at Red Bull, Pierre Vacher, who said that while the car was absolutely brilliant and of course dominated so much of the season that only missed out on 1 race victory, its biggest failing was that it didn't suit both drivers. And of course, they look to improve each year. So one of the big things he said, I mean, we'll have to see what actually comes out at the other end in winter testing, is to make a car that both drivers can get the most from, which I guess leads to the question, Spencer, will Red Bull do it all over again? Will they win all but 1 race? Will they win all races in 2024? And can Perez be a bigger part of that success next year?
I tend not to think so, because problems don't get unbroke. And I think there's a definite problem with Sergio Perez and his perception of his role at Red Bull. And I think when Nate said he got into his own head about his results, I think that once you're destabilized and once you kind of lose that confidence, then I think it goes both ways. And I think everybody's going to be on watch. So I think the fuse is lit there. I don't know when it's going to go, but I do see long-term that just doesn't seem like a stable situation. Now, does Red Bull manage to thrive despite that? Absolutely. Like Red Bull is more than any other team to me is about the team at the cost of anything else. And that includes the number of drivers that they have chewed through in the sub Verstappen tier. Okay. The sport is littered with ex-Red Bull drivers who have left and thrived elsewhere. I think Sergio Perez will become one of those sooner rather than later. I don't think that's going to affect the show. I don't think that's going to affect how Red Bull does. I think they will just keep grinding on because the technical advantage that they have, I don't think it'll be as substantial. I think when you go, okay, well, what is their evidence? What evidence is there to say that? I think teams like McLaren, like really narrowing the gap. I think Mercedes completely retooling for next year and hopefully not having a dysfunctional dolphin of a car will hopefully improve their prospects. I just think there's too much money and too much IQ and too much shuffling behind the scenes on the engineering side from what I've read to say, okay, it's going to be status quo. They'll still be dominant. I just don't think it's going to be the exact same degree of dominance we've seen.
Okay, quick one-word answers just to finish on Red Bull. If Perez does leave, either mid-season, as Nate suggested he may do, or at the end of 2024, who do you replace him with, Nate? And we know there's contracts in place and blah, blah, blah. But to the best of your knowledge, who would be available? Who would you replace him with in 2025?
Danny Rick.
Spencer?
Yeah, the only real American on the grid, Danny Rick.
I mean,
All right, okay.
We can put a star there as well. I think Albon you could put in the mix as well. But I think right now, my bet would be Danny Rick. I know that's more than one word. Sorry, I just wrote.
No, that's all right. No. I mean, it's certainly the most likely, and I guess we should give a bit of reasoning for why we're saying it. Of course, Daniel Ricciardo, Alpha Tauri, so best place to move into it. But let's move on to Mercedes. Of course, second in the championship, but without a race win. The first season they haven't won a race since 2011. So not really a success. Toto Wolff was speaking about it in Abu Dhabi, saying that it was very much bittersweet and that it was really just a reminder, by finishing P2, it was just a reminder that they hadn't won the championship, which didn't feel too great. Now, we talked a bit about Lewis because he wasn't in our top three behind Max Verstappen earlier in the podcast. And now's our chance to explain why. So, Nate, what did you feel about Lewis's season, especially in the context of what we expect from Lewis as a seven-time world champion?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lewis had a strong season. You know, that you can't get away from that. He was one of the stronger competitors of the year. You go through the season, very difficult to find many mistakes. I mean, the one that pops to mind is, I think he drove across Piastri, didn't he, in Qatar? I remember talking to him after that in the mixer. Sorry, Russell. Of course it was Russell, and he owned that mistake right afterwards. He was like, "Yeah, that was my bad." And yeah, I think obviously when a team like Mercedes has the season that Mercedes had, you can only really compare a driver to their teammate. And Lewis across the season outperformed Russell, and I think that last season we talked a lot about how a lot of those more experimental setups went Lewis's way when they were really struggling with the car, and I think that Russell had a great year. He won that race, but I think there was a feeling coming out of the year that a lot of people felt like, oh, well, Russell's outperformed Lewis. Maybe Russell's the better driver. And I think this year, to me, just internally at Mercedes, it felt like a reminder of just how good Lewis is. And I think that right now, if you were to pick who's the better driver of the two, I think it's still comfortably Lewis at this point. Russell could get there at some point. But yeah, just so quick, you always feel like Lewis is getting the best out of the car. And the thing with him as well, and Laurence, you've spoken to him more than I have this year. You've been in press conferences with him more than I have this year, but you can feel that palpable sense of frustration with him, can't you? Whenever he's talking, because he's known what it's like to win, and he's known what it's like to win at that Mercedes team, with a lot of the same guys that are still there now. And I think that what was impressive actually, and we'll see how, whether it bears fruit at the start of next season, he's been very vocal. More vocal, I think, this year even than last year, about how big the next few months are going to be for Mercedes. And it's almost, I think he's held himself to account in certain ways. I think, I forget where he was saying it now. It might have been on a podcast. It may have been at the end of the season, the final race. But he said there were times this year he started to doubt himself even. He said, when you're not getting these results, the first place you look is in the mirror. You look at yourself. So I think he's doing something which I think a lot of good leaders have to do in teams, where he's saying, look, I've got to hold myself to this standard, but the team has to be at this standard too. And I think that we were seeing that through the season from him. I'm sure there are people who are furiously writing in the comment section now that I've missed an obvious huge clanger that Lewis made this year. And maybe you guys can remember one, but it felt like a really strong season. But because we've seen Lewis win so many championships, because we were so familiar with him winning, it's amazing now, isn't it? After that, years and years of that record of, he's won a race every year of his career, we've now got two where he hasn't won a single race. It just shows you how quickly those things can change. But the norm for him was just excellence before. So I think that, it's really easy to downplay a guy like Lewis. I think he had a really, really good season. And the fact that he wasn't in my non-max top three is reflected in the fact that we just expect so much from him. But yeah, I think he was a standout performer, but I think it's not going to be a season he looks back on fondly. I think this year and last year, I think whenever it comes to be the end of his career, I think he'll look at these as kind of some of the worst of his career. And that's saying a lot as well, because, he's been in the sport for so long, and obviously hasn't always won championships. But yeah, I thought he was great.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And we should also make a little note. Of course, he signed a new 2-year contract with Mercedes going forward, so he has that confidence in the team. Clearly, apparently did not call up Christian Horner asking him about it, but his father may have asked him whether there was availability in passing at some point this year. Let's not dwell on that, but let's look at the other side of the garage. Spencer, George Russell, it seemed like the performance was maybe there, 11-11 with Lewis in qualifying. Anyone who can hold Lewis like that in qualifying over a season must be doing something right. But in the races, it just didn't seem to come together. And then, of course, there were a few high-profile mistakes as well. So what did you make of George's season?
It's interesting you mentioned Lewis's frustration, because for a while that kind of frustration seemed to be Lewis only, and George just sort of being the happy second banana. And I thought that if there was one little storyline with George Russell in 2023, it was sort of an emerging impatience or frustration with the team itself. I felt like he was more vocal this year. I don't think that was just a matter of maybe the broadcasts dipping into his headset a little more often than they had. No, I mean, I think it was very clear that he had thoughts on pit strategy, that he had complaints with some of their strategic decisions at Mercedes. I think it was clear that at times he was more vocal about the car and about what he thought the shortcomings of the car were. So I think when you look back at like the great career arc of George Russell, wherever he's going, this is this season where I think you could point, to his real sort of ambition emerging more than anything else vocally. Like he's always been ambitious, obviously. He's where he's at. But I think it became more of a visible public thing than anything else. And I think sometimes that impatience showed in racing too. Like when he made mistakes, I felt like they were generally products of, frustrated ambition more than anything else.
Right,
and
now, before... go on.
So just as a quick one on that as well. I remember, and this is, I know that Laurence is going to think I'm just bringing up Ricciardo because I love the guy, but I remember Ricciardo in 2014 when he joined Red Bull. He gave a really revealing interview at the end of that year where he said one of the biggest frustrations he had was he'd come in and he felt like he was ready to win a world championship. He'd joined Red Bull, who had won 4 straight championships. He gets to the car in 2014 and it's not there. The car is, third quickest, fourth quickest. Russell's had that same thing, those years waiting at Williams. I think he had years where he felt I should be in that car instead of Bottas. He gets to Mercedes and they're not the quickest anymore. And that, I think, mentally, when you're a younger driver, that must be really difficult to deal with, because you look at it and you're like, all these guys think they can be world champion. And I think that 2 years of that now, I think 1 year he could have dealt with, 2 years and not seeing a huge step forward, I think that starts to weigh on him. So next year, if I was Toto Wolff, I'd actually be more worried about, where George is going to be at mentally, because Lewis is at the end of his career. He knows this is it for him. I don't think there's anywhere else he's going to go. But for Russell, you start to question, am I going to win the championship at this team? And that can be a dangerous mindset to get into, I think.
Okay, well, obvious question then. Will Mercedes have a car capable of fighting for a championship next year? Have they got the building blocks in place? They made some changes this year.
I think 2025, I would put money on that. I think next year, Red Bull, that gap is so big. And I really trust a team like Mercedes to do it. But yeah, I just think to expect that over the next few months and into next season, I think it's a lot. I think that what is probably more likely, or if you're Mercedes, you would hope to see, is they start challenging for wins midway through the season, towards the end of the year, and then they go into 25. A bit like we saw with Red Bull a little bit in 2020, kind of building up to 21, just getting a bit stronger, and then improving in that final off season. Obviously, I'd love to see it, but it feels like such a long way off for Mercedes and for all the guys in that chasing pack.
Okay, well, let's consign the W14 to the rubbish bin, trash cans of Brackley, and move on to Ferrari. The only team to win a race other than Red Bull this year, which is pretty remarkable, more from a Red Bull point of view than Ferrari. But the race winner there was Carlos Sainz. It was a pretty solid season, and I think there were some real flashes of brilliance, of course, Monza as well, where he qualified on pole and held off Verstappen for so long. So, Spencer, Sainz, did he fulfill his full potential? Do you look at him now more as a even match for Leclerc at Ferrari?
And not yet, because I still feel like Carlos Sainz is the gifted kid who doesn't do his homework. Like I feel like in terms of drivers, I feel like he's the guy who, when it comes to qualifying or doing some of the technical stuff that you need to do, he sometimes falls behind and then has to make up that gap during the race. Like, to me right now, he is the best guy who, if I said he's in P15 right now, and you take Max Verstappen off the board, and you say, where does he end up? Does he end up, P5? Does he end up P4? I have a lot of confidence in Carlos doing that. I think he's a great come from behind driver at this point. I don't think he is a leader of the pack style driver like I think Leclerc is capable of being, because of mistakes, because of mental lapses, because of sometimes, outright rotten Ferrari style bad luck. But I think Sainz is still, I think this is good news when you say, I think Carlos Sainz is still a work in progress, and I still think there's growth to be had there.
And of course, in Leclerc, he's going up against arguably the best qualifier on the grid. I mean, that's where I'd put Leclerc. So it's a tough job for Sainz. But yeah, let's talk about Charles a little bit, Nate. According to the Italian media, he's signed a new 5-year contract with Ferrari, having just, at the end of next year, he will come to the end of his existing 5-year contract with Ferrari. I mean, there's a lot of memes going around about him kind of signing up for another 5 years of bad luck, pain, and all the rest of it. Do you think if that's the case, and it's a pretty well-sourced article in Gazzetta dello Sport, do you think that that's the right choice for Charles after the certain amounts of disappointment he had this year?
I mean, I don't think a long deal like that is, no. I mean, we know there's what we think is going to be a big reset in 2026 coming, and it just feels like committing beyond that at this stage is really tricky. Of course, you could look at it and you could say, well, maybe Ferrari's the team that gets that right in 2026 with the new engine regs. So maybe that's where his head is at, and he knows better than anyone what is going on behind the scenes there. But it does seem like a long way along, a big commitment to a team that we haven't seen huge progress from. We've seen glimpses like we saw in Singapore with Sainz winning, but then again, I do think about it and I look at. We were saying the same about Lando at the start of last year, start of 2022, when he signed that long deal. And it seemed for a year and a half, it was like, what on earth has he done? McLaren come with that big upgrade to Austria. Suddenly he's up there fighting for second. Suddenly McLaren look at it and they're like, well, we're actually not far away from being able to challenge for a championship. And suddenly you think, well, actually, maybe there was some logic to that deal. It's not as long as Charles's would be. Obviously, we're talking about contracts signed at different times, but those things can turn around quite quickly. So I don't want to sit here and say, oh, it's a terrible idea or a terrible decision, but it's hard to see the logic of it. And I think it speaks a lot as well to the fact that if you look at Red Bull right now, committed with Max long term through to 2028, I think. You look at McLaren, they've signed Piastri down beyond that 2026. Lando's likely to stay beyond there, I would say, unless he goes on to Audi. I don't know if you're Charles, if you take that big risk of going to Audi when they get there in 26. So really, I think there's two things going on. One is a loyalty to Ferrari, but also, if you're really honest about it, and then obviously Mercedes have Russell and Hamilton. And let's be honest, I think if those two guys want to stay, I think Mercedes would keep them beyond 26. I still think that's the strongest lineup on the grid right now. So really, as much as it's a decision he's making, I don't think there's a huge amount of options to him available that seem like better steps than staying at Ferrari. You're still at the most famous team in racing, and there's whoever is the first driver to win that championship after so long. I think it's going to be one of the most special championships anyone wins in Formula One, just because of the history and the story around Ferrari. So there's that pull. They've supported him his whole career. I mean, look at Lewis with Mercedes. The loyalty he has to that manufacturer. So it's easy for us to sit here and second guess it. For me, it seems like a slightly wild decision. But if you put yourself into Charles's head, you look at it from the business point of view, and you tug on the heartstrings a little bit, you can understand that. But yeah, if you were betting on who the next team that isn't Red Bull to win a championship would be, I think Ferrari's one of the braver calls to make. So he's maybe in Vegas he got the gambling bug, and he's just rolling dice now down a craps table and just seeing what sticks.
Yeah, in that vein though, you are right. The emotional payoff of being that driver and of never having to spend $1 in Italy again for anything. It's a spectacular storyline.
Yeah, and look, I think Ferrari, as much as any team, the pull of driving there must be huge. And for Charles, I mean, they've supported him from the beginning. So to leave that, and I think Charles, he's a very nice guy. He seems when you see him interviewed, he seems like somebody who's very, he's very loyal to the team. He's always defended Ferrari, even when he's upset. He doesn't fully throw them under the bus. He's always, he's a good employee for the team, isn't he? So I feel like it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. They both suit each other. Ferrari, he feels like kind of the prodigal son a little bit. He's the guy. They've put all of their resources into this. He got there. They got rid of Vettel when Charles arrived. I think that pull has got a much bigger is a much bigger factor than we're maybe giving it credit for outside of this podcast.
Yeah, even Lewis Hamilton, who's won 7 world championships, gets asked regularly, are you going to finish your career without having driven for Ferrari, because it's such a big deal? The answer is usually that he's quite okay with that. But it is a big deal driving for Ferrari. And of course, as you both said, imagine being the driver who ends the title drought, which currently goes back to 2007 for a driver's title, 2008 for a constructors. Okay, let's move on to McLaren. Now, we've talked a lot about the 2 drivers, Piastri and Lando Norris, earlier, both for very positive reasons. So let's talk about the team. They kind of finished the year almost as second best in a lot of places to Red Bull. For a long time, McLaren have been in this wilderness. We won't get bogged down in the full history of it, but awful years with Honda as an engine supplier, then switched to Renault, didn't really make much progress. Finally, they've got a Mercedes engine in the back that seems to work, and they've been able to, this year really, during the season, develop the car into a sensible place. Spencer, what happens next? Is this the stepping stone to fighting for championships, or would you expect to see McLaren slip back relative to some of the more well-funded opposition?
To me, right now, they have the best setup for an underdog. They have their engine sourced, right? So they don't necessarily have to worry about that. They can focus on everything else, aero, et cetera, that they have to do. So they don't have to devote resources to, the big expensive thing. They've sorted that. They have 2 great drivers, like 2 great drivers. That is massive. Management largely in place. I think that confidence-wise, it's hard to engineer a bigger 180 than they did this season from start to finish. It really is. And that kind of momentum is the kind of thing that it is tempting to push forward. It's tempting to say, well, they're on the up. Okay. There's nothing stopping them from just plateauing. Nothing, right? There's nothing stopping them from plateauing and others making gains, right? Like if this offseason and this season proved anything, it's that, you will see surprises like Aston Martin's dominance in the early part of the season, which, I didn't see coming. I know smarter people did, but like, I think the general mass of people did not expect that kind of thing. So how's this? I'm cautiously optimistic. It seems like that McLaren has a lot of really, really good things in place. And I think that saying that they're one of the top 4, maybe top 3, if you're real optimistic, I think that's there. But they don't have the same kind of resources pushing forward. Other people are doing the exact kind of work that they did. So rein it in a little bit. I want to. I love seeing orange on the podium. I love this pair of drivers a lot. I think Zach Brown did a fantastic job in terms of keeping everyone on board and keeping that thing from going off the road. But those are sentiments. I'm going to go ahead and say cautiously optimistic.
And how much potential is there? Because we know the wider plan isn't 100% in place. You've got Rob Marshall still to come, David Sanchez to come into the technical team, and a wind tunnel that I think is online now, but was really working towards next year. So, what do you expect from them going forward?
Yeah, and I think 20. I mentioned 25 for Mercedes. I think that is the plan for McLaren, and that is what seems realistic. I spoke to Zach Brown almost exactly a year ago, and I remember him saying, he was like, the aim is to win a championship or to challenge for championship in 2025. And now wind back 12 months. When I heard that, I was like, that's a bold statement given where you are. You look at it now, and they're on that path to it. And you're right, Laurence, the wind tunnel they opened this year, it didn't have a big impact on this year's car. Next year's car is going to be the one where they're going to really be able to see the benefits of that. And obviously that then has a knock-on effect to 2025. You're right about the personnel they're bringing in. And also, Spencer, you're right to shout out about Zach Brown, but also Andreas Stella there as team boss, I think, has done an incredible job. Coming in, Seidel was really well thought of, within the paddock, just what he did with McLaren. But Stella coming in, I've got to say, really, really impressed. And if you listen to Zach Brown talk, he puts so much credit on Stella's shoulders for just the way he's been able to manage that team. And yeah, I think that 2025, the reason I say that and not 2024 is I think that Brown and Stella are both being very, very cautious in not rushing this. They've seen that they're on the right path now. They've seen how long it took them to get out of it. And I think that they realize you don't just start winning again overnight. They probably should have won or at least come closer to winning this year if Max wasn't so far ahead. I think that the goal next year has to be getting win number 1 for Lando and win number 1 for Oscar. I know he's won the sprint race, but Grand Prix wins under their belts. Go into 2025 with a strong car, 2 very, very confident drivers, 2 drivers with a victory under their belt, and 2 guys who feel like it's their time. And I think that we're slowly getting that from McLaren now. And the key thing with McLaren as well is the belief is back. I didn't, I doubted McLaren massively. At the start of the season, I just thought, when is this team? I mean, watching Formula One growing up, it was inconceivable to think that a team like McLaren would design bad cars year after year, but that's the state we got to. And now we're getting back to a point where it's like, okay, you can start to put some real faith behind these guys. So yeah, next year, I think what we need to see from McLaren is victories, pole positions. I'm very much on the pessimistic side. I don't think we're going to see somebody challenging Max and Red Bull from race 1. But if they get to the end of that season and they're looking strong, then I think we're in a good place with them. And just a quick one on that conversation I had with Zach. I then followed it up after Austria this year. And the interesting thing he said, which puts this year into context really, was around the time of last year's summer break when they got rid of Ricciardo and there was all that stuff. He said things were starting to feel very, very bad before they looked good. And he said at preseason, when they looked bad on the outside, he said internally, they were actually starting to feel very good. He felt like, the numbers they were having from their upgrade that was coming were very, very positive. They were seeing a lot of really, really good things down the line. So it's just interesting. And I think that Brown clearly has that longer term view for things. So yeah, 2025 seems realistic. And honestly, if there's a team I'm most excited about on the grid, I would point at McLaren, just because young driver lineup, as you said, Laurence, all those guys joining, they're just, the momentum is there with them. They're on the up, and it feels like, that upward trajectory, we haven't seen the last of it. It should keep going into next year and beyond.
Had we been doing a mid-season review, you probably would have said similar stuff about Aston Martin, because the first half of the year was pretty impressive, a huge step over the winter. But Spencer, you mentioned McLaren's momentum and how important that could be for them. Well, Aston Martin don't really have that because it tailed away towards the end of the year. What do you think has happened there? And do you think it's rectifiable for next year to make sure they continue to be a front runner?
I think that given the gains that they made in the off season last time and whatever they put together to get them out in front early, there's no reason to think that a team that talented can't come up with similar advantages and little tweaks to the car to keep them at least as competitive, if not moving upward. I think that though they had something that other teams didn't, which was the boost of Fernando Alonso and Alonso's stunning form. You shouldn't be this good at this age. You just shouldn't. Your nerves shouldn't work this well. But Fernando Alonso is a freak, and it's hard to tell the story of Alonso being such a competitive marvel within Aston Martin without telling the story of Lance Stroll on the other side, because a lot of those numbers, when we talk about, outqualing his teammate 19-3, winning the race against him 17-4, it's impossible to tell that story without going, what is Lance Stroll doing? Do you see anything from him? Because with the same tools, he wasn't nearly as impressive. I know I just said that somebody wasn't as impressive as Fernando Alonso. That's true of 99.9% of Formula One drivers, much less the general public. But Stroll's lack of consistency, and he did drive through an injury. I think he deserves credit for that. I think that displayed real toughness, but at the same time, there is a structural thing with Aston Martin that you can't get around, which is Lance Stroll. When the principal's son is there and not really budgeable, then you have a natural governor on the potential of the team overall.
Yeah, Nate, what do Aston Martin do about Lance Stroll? Do they continue with him? Do they look at other options? Is there anything they can do? Do you ever see Laurence Stroll telling his son that he's going to have to either look to drive elsewhere or leave F1?
Well, yeah, I don't see that ever happening. And I think we got a clear indication of that. It feels like a little bit almost gaslighting through the year. When you would you'd hear from Mike Crack. I know you spoke to Laurence Stroll, a few weeks ago. The way they talk about Stroll is just patently not true. They'll say, oh, he's on a par with Fernando, their seasons have been the same. And you just look at it and you're like, well, we know that's not true. We know that's not the case. And I think that's the most frustrating thing, is that like Spencer said, there's no shame in admitting a driver is not competing as well as Fernando Alonso. And the thing with Stroll, you do occasionally see, he has these glimpses through a year where he has some very, very strong results. I just don't think they're enough to be in Formula One. And if you took his dad out of the equation and he was just a guy, I don't think there's anything about his record that would suggest he'd stay in Formula One. I think Stroll could go and have a very successful career in other formula, in other series elsewhere. From talking to people who've worked with him at Williams, especially, they say that there is raw talent there. It's just, it's not as focused. There's always a question about his commitment. And Spencer's right as well. He had that injury, which I was impressed he came back from in the way he did. So I don't want to just just dump on him completely. But I think if you're looking at a clear weakness for Aston Martin right now, Lance Stroll is it. And if that team wants to be a serious contender at the front, given the fact they have Alonso in the other car, Stroll either has to massively improve or they have to look for other options. And that's the thing. There are so many options right now on the grid. You talk about the Charles Leclerc deal. People are going to start signing deals that, that take them out of the equation. So the longer Aston Martin wait for Stroll, the fewer options are going to have to replace him. So the obvious answer is they should replace him. But the more logical answer, or the more sensible answer, is that they probably won't ever, not while Laurence Stroll is in charge of the team.
Okay, midway through the grid, and we're on to Alpine. And of course, that's not where Alpine wanted to be this year. They were hoping to push up from their 4th place finish in 2022, and the objective was to close the gap to the top 3. Of course, that picture's slightly changed this year. But even so, Alpine's fortunes haven't really, and there was huge disruption at the team. Otmar Zafnauer, the team principal, got the boot in Belgium, along with sporting director Alan Permain, and I don't know if what they've got in place is going to solve the problems. What do you think, Spencer? Do you think that Alpine can ever get to where they aim to be?
Yeah, they have like 1,000 new investors, and they're all celebrities. 1,000 new famous investors, and booted out everyone. And the only constants they had were 2 drivers who are always so close that they're in danger of wrecking each other. And that's Alpine. Alpine's a mess. And I think when we're sitting here going, well, we're really looking to 2025 for a competitive Mercedes or McLaren. Let's push that out for Alpine. Let's push that out. Let's just go extend that to 26, 27. This seems like a long-term kind of rebuild for Alpine. I do think they have 2 great drivers. I think either one of them are definitely in my Carlos Sainz category of start you P15, you could end up top 5. I think that's they're both great drivers in terms of the comeback. Their technical setup hasn't been great, nor is their managerial or organizational one. So let's just leave that on pause. Let's just leave that on. The best news that Alpine has is that Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney are investors now, and apparently when they buy a sports franchise, they immediately turn them around and win. So let's go ahead. I'm sorry, I said 2026 or 7. Next year, evidently they win a title next year if Deadpool and the guy from It's Always Sunny have something to say with it.
Well, clearly what they need is a documentary.
Yes,
with maybe some translation from French where they make or France where they make the engines, and to England where they make that chassis, which never quite seems to be what it should be. Let's see. I mean, we could talk about Alpine. We have done actually on this podcast for at length, but let's leave it there for now and hope they come back a little bit stronger next year. And move on to Williams that finished 7th in the Constructors' Championship. Best results since 2017, most points since 2017. New team principal in James Vowles. It's all gone rather well. And we actually have some relatively new news from Williams, which is Logan Sargeant has got another year up the team to try and improve on his single point that he scored this year. Nate, right decision to stick with Sargeant?
I keep changing my mind on this, honestly. I think, ultimately there's not a huge amount of options out there for Williams that seem like viable candidates. Logan brings with him the fact that he's American. They've obviously got American owners at the moment. There's an obvious tie in there. And I think Sargeant, I think the feeling you got from Williams was that the overriding feelings James Vowles had was it's difficult to judge this guy based on a rookie year. You're based on a year when Albon's really performing well. Albon's been there for 2 years. Albon, I think was really the comparison is a bit like when Russell was with Latifi. the comparison always makes one of the guys look bad. And we saw these glimpses from Sargeant, a bit like what I was saying with Stroll. You see occasionally. I remember that there was huge hype, wasn't there, around the way that Sargeant started his first race. Like the first few corners of Bahrain were mega, and everyone was like, "Oh, this Sargeant guy looks amazing." And then we didn't really see anything from him for a long time after that. And the mistakes crept in, and the middle of his season, it reminded me a bit too much of Mick Schumacher or Mazepin, at Haas. Maybe not as extreme as that, but most of the time you saw him on TV was when he'd made a mistake, was when he'd done something that had kind of jeopardized his race or his weekend that was coming up. So the big thing for him, obviously, in this year is that those mistakes have to go in his sophomore season. You can't do that again. And we'll see. I mean, whether it's the right decision or not will be justified or will be answered by, if we're sitting here next year and Sargeant's had an incredible season, then James Vowles will look like a genius. And I think Williams are kind of in the position where I think you can afford to make this call. You've got a competitive guy in the other car. You've got a guy delivering. You can kind of take a bit of a gamble here and say, well, Sargeant, they clearly saw enough from him to justify the second year, I think. And I've got to say, one of the most awkward videos I've ever seen in my life as a Formula One fan, the videos they put up of James Vowles and Logan Sargeant talking after the contract announcement. Never seen anything like those before. But in one of those, Vowles says they're like picking up these pieces of like these pictures, and he points to Qatar when Sargeant was feeling very, very sick, and clearly wanted to race on despite the fact he was one of the drivers having that, those really extreme heat problems. And I think that ultimately Sargeant was racing a lot of the year. You get the impression that he was a bit like what we were saying with Perez. He was overdriving. He was pushing himself too much because he knew what was on the line. I think Williams, as soon as they got him out of that, they said, look, just drive the car. And I'm trying to think of how he finished the season. And annoyingly, the results page that I had up has just disappeared from my phone. So I was desperately trying to look at here. But it seems like towards the end of the year, we were talking less about Sargeant making mistakes, less about Sargeant, massively being, out of form or whatever. And yeah, ultimately, they've made that call. I'm not convinced it's the right one, but if you look across the field, you'd like to see someone like Drugovich in there, who's obviously, has won Formula 2 before, but he's linked with Aston Martin. So, there's all these things that come into it. Unless you go back for someone like De Vries, who's obviously your reputation this year was just dragged through the mud. I don't see where else Williams could have gone. So it seems like, a decision they kind of had to make, and a decision that, I think they know what the consequence of that decision is. If it's wrong, it's just that they've just got to find someone new for 25. So worth taking the risk on, I'd say. Sargeant's young enough. But I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you guys agree it was the right call or not, but I feel like for me, I'm not convinced.
Well, I'd like to hear Spencer's view on this as the only actual American on this podcast, rather than two Englishmen talk about Sargeant. Is it important that there's an American on the grid, Spencer? And is Logan the right guy?
Not at all. I don't think it's important that there's an American on the grid, because I think you've seen the growth of international sports or sports with an international roster here. I think you've seen that occur without an American on the roster. I think EPL is a great example. When somebody goes, well, what about outside of F1? EPL is a great example. People just enjoy the sport, and it really doesn't matter what the roster is, as long as there's this, great characters, and personalities that they can sort of, and brands they can hang their hat on. I don't think it's essential to have Logan Sargeant. In fact, I think when it's Logan Sargeant and he's given a very slim chance to succeed by competing for Williams and doing so at a very young age, it might be detrimental to the cause completely. I joke about Daniel Ricciardo being the only American on the roster, but there's a serious point behind it, which is his charisma and personality and unique sense of humor all put him in a position where I think he's great for the American audience, and especially for the lay audience, because of how open he is to talking, PR, being on camera, being funny, being vulnerable, being himself. So I don't think it's entirely necessary. And I think that that's an unfair burden to place on Logan Sargeant too. If you do saddle him with national expectations, then inevitably he's going to disappoint, just because of where he's at, both in his career and in terms of what team he's driving for.
I think that's excuse me. I think that's a really fair point, actually. And it makes me think about a driver like Kimi Räikkönen, for example, obviously Finnish. I mean, he had lots of fans in Finland, but he had a remarkable amount of fans around the world. And part of that was based on success. Part of that was based on personality. And it wasn't really anything to do with nationality. So, I think that's a fair point. we have talked about Alex Albon already on this podcast and what a remarkable job he did. My only question I'm going to pose to both of you on him, just quickly, is what does he do with his career going forward? Obviously, he's at Williams next year, but should he be looking to get out of Williams and drive for a different team, or should he try and be part of bringing Williams to the front of the grid? Nate, you go first.
Well, I think his contract is one of the big confusing points when you look across the deals currently, because I think he's got himself locked into this deal now with Williams. I think if Albon had a contract that he could have got out of this year, I think he would have done. I think he would have got out of it at the end of this season going into next year. And Williams says, as I mentioned in the Sargeant answer, they know they've got a competitive driver in the other car. So there's no desire on the Vals side to let Albon leave anytime soon, because he's scoring the points that are so important to them this year. So yeah, I think whatever he can do to get out of that deal, I think is key. But these contracts in Formula One, they're funny, aren't they? Some of them we hear have loopholes, and from what I've heard about Albon's, is it's pretty watertight, and for him to get out of it would be pretty unlikely. So imagine if his story after all of this, he comes back to Formula One and then he gets stuck in the first contract he signs coming back to Formula One and is really unable to take advantage of the opportunities that, I know from speaking to people close to Albon, they say that teams have approached both last year and this year and said, what's your availability? And they've had to turn around and say, well, sorry, at the moment, we just can't do anything. And that's a horrible situation for a driver to be in, because, you see some of the opportunities slipping away from you. Must be frustrating. So yeah, if you're him, you've got to be looking at that contract, getting some very, very clever lawyers to read the fine print, but I don't think he's going anywhere for the time being.
Okay, theoretically though, Spencer, let's say that you have read the fine print and you found an exit clause and you're Albon's manager. Who are you going to be knocking on the door of? Where do you think he would fit going forward?
Red Bull. Just right, the Perez seat right there. And also, there's an important loophole in every contract, which is emotion. If the parties involved don't like the feeling, then the words and terms become malleable.
Yeah, well, we've seen that so many times in F1. There's no point in having a driver in your team who desperately wants to be somewhere else and isn't a part of it going forward. Right. Okay. So let's talk about a team that cycled through a number of drivers this year. Yuki Tsunoda was the constant, but alongside him was a teammate. He had Nick de Vries, he had Daniel Ricciardo, he had Liam Lawson, and then he had Daniel Ricciardo again. It seemed like a pretty strong season by Yuki. He's actually a driver I featured in my top 10. I don't think he's featured in many top 10s that I've seen elsewhere, but I think he was really quite good this year, especially coming from the base that he had before, where he was sometimes brilliant, often inconsistent. Nate, what do you think of Yuki's season?
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think that he's one of the most underrated drivers, certainly on the basis of this season. And I think that part of that is to do with the drama of the other seat, part of the fact that, Spencer's right. Danny Rick came in alongside him. I think that overshadows Yuki quite a bit. But if you take all of Yuki's, 3 seasons now and put them next to each other, this one is by far the strongest one. We saw glimpses in those other 2 seasons. And Red Bull, you've always felt that Red Bull haven't quite been sure about Yuki's talent. I mean, there was that podcast appearance that Christian Horner did where it felt like he was trying to force out some nice things to say about Tsunoda, which is bizarre after such a good season for Yuki. And given the fact that the whole point of the Red Bull driver program is to try and find a driver to race at the top team. And I think this season, the most impressive thing is that I still think you see glimpses of it, but that kind of unpredictable attitude that we sometimes hear from Yuki in the car seemed to be a bit less. You'd always hear these crazy radio messages, and he didn't take his training as seriously in previous years. And I think that he's made a lot of little improvements across the board that I think have had a big impact across the year. And if he can continue that into next season, then again, with the whole Perez conversation going on, I don't think there's any reason, on paper why he shouldn't be in that mix. There's obviously reasons behind the scenes potentially at Red Bull that they might not want him. But yeah, I was really impressed with him, and it's a shame really, because his season did go under the radar just given everything else going on at AlphaTauri.
Yeah, Spencer, let's talk about the 2 drivers who drove for AlphaTauri this year but won't be there next year. Of course, Ricciardo continuing as Tsunoda's teammate. So that's Lawson and de Vries. How sorry do you feel for the 2 of them, and what did you make of their performances when they had a go in the car?
Nick de Vries was at times a non-entity, and I think looked overwhelmed. And it's one of the reasons why I had Piastri in my top 3 is when you compared him to how the other rookies did. He was just leagues ahead of them in terms of composure. That's nothing I think you can blame Nick de Vries for. I think that he was just in a bad situation. It's a bad fit. I feel bad for him because he's lost a Formula One seat, and those are difficult to get back. Liam Lawson, it's a slightly different arrangement. When I talked to him, he seemed cautiously optimistic about where he might end up down the road, provided that he stayed loyal and followed the plan. I think he's very much on Red Bull's plan. I think he's trying to stay very much on their radar. I don't think he seemed overwhelmed by the bright lights. I think he drove really well. His is, I think, a happier story than de Vries. Man, if you wanted AlphaTauri, say this for them. If you wanted a variety of cast members, that's the team to follow. You will get the most drivers per race when you were dealing with AlphaTauri 2023.
And Nate, our producer Zach, has insisted that we let you have the final word on Daniel Ricciardo's season, and rightly so, because you've been called before the Ricciardo whisperer. So what can you tell us about Daniel's season, his comeback from that broken hand, and what to expect from him next year?
Well, I think overall we started to see glimpses of the Daniel Rick of old this year. We spoke to him at the start of the season at the Red Bull launch in New York. And you could tell he was happier than he had been at McLaren. Obviously, he then comes back to the team. And I think that just being back, being away from Formula One, it's funny, isn't it? It's a bit like when you speak to Kevin Magnussen about the time he spent away. Sometimes being away from Formula One is more important than the years you spend in Formula One for your motivation, because you go away and you really realize, these guys realize, this is how much I want this. I think Ricciardo realized it's still something I want to do. There's still some unfinished business there. I was really fortunate in Vegas to spent a whole day with him pretty much, in the week leading up to Vegas. Talked to him quite a lot about that. And yeah, he just seems in such a good place right now with those things. And I think going into next season, he's going to have a full year under his belt. I think that he knows, and he's made it clear, what he wants is that Red Bull seat at the end of it. And I think now he's got that goal, he's got that hunger back, and he's back at a team that ultimately he feels like this is home for him. We talked about Charles and how close he feels to Ferrari and Lewis with Mercedes. I think for Ricciardo, it's the same with Red Bull. He feels like that's his home. And I think now, if you asked him with the benefit of hindsight, he would say, yeah, leaving for Renault was the mistake. I shouldn't have done it. He's back there now. He's not one to dwell on the past too much. And yeah, I'm pretty excited to see him next year. I think Red Bull are hoping that AlphaTauri, or whatever we'll call them next season, we still don't know what their name's going to be going into next year, are going to be a much more competitive outfit just across the board. And if that is the case, that's why, a lot of people say, well, why won't they put Ricciardo in the Perez seat? That's the whole reason why. Red Bull are looking at it as, we want 2 competitive teams next year. They're not talking about having AlphaTauri being second or third in the championship, but they want them closer into that midfield gap, and having this Ricciardo in that team makes a ton of sense. And for him, I think it's basically an audition year, for that Red Bull seat. I think Christian Horner is a huge fan of Daniel Ricciardo. He knows what Daniel Ricciardo is about. He's worked with him for years and years and years. And now it's just a case of, can he deliver consistently, and can he prove that the Ricciardo we saw at McLaren was the Ricciardo? Did he leave that behind at McLaren, or has he carried that with him? Because if you're putting somebody up against Max Verstappen, you don't want any hint that there's some mental weakness there at all, because as we've seen, he can crush a driver's confidence over the course of a season. So, I think he's still a fair way from that Red Bull seat, but the fact he came back, and I think the grid is better off for having Ricciardo on it. He's such an entertaining character. I think he's one of the more talented drivers we've seen in F1, over the past few years. Still, I think quite a fair question mark over whether he was ever championship caliber or whether he was just very, very good. I think that we saw glimpses at Red Bull that he was very, very good. And then obviously, we never got to see that. I would have loved to have seen the Verstappen of 2018. Sorry, the Ricciardo of 2018 against the Verstappen of 2021 and 2022. That would have been fascinating to see whether Verstappen's level now is how far ahead of that Ricciardo it was. And hopefully we get a chance to see it in the same car. I'm not sure that Ricciardo will ever win that championship, but to have him come back and win some races would be mega. And this is the first step to that. So great to see him back. Great to see him happy and performing. And yeah, that could be I think AlphaTauri low key could be one of the more fun storylines next year to keep an eye on.
So you mentioned AlphaTauri changing their name next year. We're not quite sure what to. Alfa Romeo is also a name that will be leaving Formula One, or has left Formula One already at the end of this year. And they'll be back to plain old Sauber next year and until 2026 when Audi comes in with engines and branding and all the rest that comes with it. I, for one, am quite sad about this because I think the Alfa Romeo liveries were consistently the best liveries on the grid this year. I don't know if there's any debate amongst that, gentlemen, if there's another one which caught your eye up and down the grid.
No, they look like, honestly, they look like a very expensive dairy product, and that's really all I want out of my liveries.
It's all you want in life, a very expensive dairy product. Nate, any favorites for you?
No, I think you're right.
The Alfa Romeo chat, but while we're on the subject.
Yeah, no, I think Alfa Romeo have kind of raised the bar there quite a bit. I loved the Vegas Ferrari with the white on it. I thought that was great for a one-off. Yeah, clean. And there's a theme there. Italian cars, Italian brands at least, with the strongest
Italian style. Indeed. I guess
one sec. My dad's just calling me. We're trying to get tickets for this Norwich game, and he's like, I'm holding a ticket for 3 minutes. I'm just going to try and log on. But you can,
as long as this can be on the podcast, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look,
let's see if Nate gets tickets.
I'll tell you what. Ask Spencer. You guys do the Alfa Romeo, and I'll just come back in when I do or don't have a ticket. Ipswich Norwich, biggest game in 10 years for us. So.
Okay, good luck, Nate, and let's hope it comes through.
Thank you very much.
Probably a sign of how long this podcast is going on for that Nate is in the middle of buying tickets midway through. But Spencer, let's just quickly talk about Sauber properly. It seems like the improvements they need to be able to fight for championships in 2026 when Audi come in, which is absolutely what they've stated as their aim. It feels like the improvements aren't there enough. How big a step do they need to make next year, and are you confident they can make it?
There's so many things that they're shuffling here. Like this is a team that's between names. This is a team that I believe is going to move most of the operations to England. They're going to launch the car there for the first time next year. This is a team that's waiting for Audi to come through. There's so much up in the air. I know that we said that with a team like AlphaTauri, it's not even close when it comes to Sauber in terms of the number of things that they have in transition right now. So you could say both of these things at the same time. They were mostly non-functional as a race team and not really a presence week to week when it came to the grid. They really weren't. They were consistently in the bottom with Haas. At the same time, that's totally understandable given everything that they're going through organizationally. So slight improvement there. Like that's it. Let's see if all the new stuff takes. Let's see if we get a little more consistency out of Sauber. But on the whole, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of reason for drastic optimism here.
And what about their two drivers? I mean, it seems unlikely that those will be the two drivers that Audi take into 2026. So what do they need to do, especially your man Valtteri? Again, like you said at the start of the podcast, maybe not quite performing as he would have liked this year.
No. And I think, as you said, he would admit that he wasn't at the level he wanted to be at either. I think we're between a known and an unknown quantity when it comes to the drivers. I think that we know what Bottas is capable of, and he's capable of truly great racing. I think for Guan Yu Zhou, that to me, that's where I think he's in a tough spot, because I think Valtteri has a definite ceiling, and whereas I think when you have something like Zhou, we have yet to sort of see where his. I don't know if we have the good matchup between platform and driver here to see what Zhou is capable of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. It's been a bit of an unknown, and of course he got his contract renewed fairly early on. I think it was Singapore this year, so there's still confidence there. But I do feel like it's a bit of a holding pattern, Alfa Romeo, more than anything else. Well, one question I have to ask you, Spencer, before we bring Nate back into this. Mm-hmm. Did you get hold of the Bottas calendar for 2020?
It's on the way. It's a Christmas gift. So that means that, by the way, I'm going to have 3 Valtteri Bottas butt-themed pieces of art in my house. 2 of the original Colorado still that he had, because I bought one and someone sent me one. So I have one in reserve. Should the other one be, should I lose that in a fire or something? I have the other one. And then I have the calendar, which I will remind you, this is all for charity. But yeah, when you get a chance to have Valtteri Bottas's ass hanging in your house, you take it whenever you can get it.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, and great effort by Valtteri as well.
Yeah,
Posing to
good on him.
those with Paul Ripka, and then also raising all that money for Movember. Right, Nate, are you back with us?
I am. Yeah, I'm still without ticket, but we'll
That's
keep trying.
Yeah. Okay. Well, can I ask you about Haas? Have you got time for that?
Yes, of course, absolutely.
Right. I mean, look, here's a team that pretty much set up like unlike any other team on the grid, and I think now starting to show. They finished the constructors last after a 2022 season that looked so promising early on, certainly, and then it seems to have dropped away. So, what can we say about Haas this year?
Yeah, I mean, they kind of bucked the trend a bit, didn't they? Because every time we saw a team with a big upgrade, whether it was, obviously the McLaren one, we saw Mercedes make a step, we saw teams introduce a big upgrade, and you could see a tangible improvement. We saw Haas kind of roll out this new concept it was Austin, wasn't it? Where that came, and they kind of just stayed in the same spot competitively. There wasn't a huge step. The drivers didn't really report that the car had got any better. So it's odd. And, I think Steiner was trying to spin that and say, well, it put us in a better position for next season, a better basis to build on. But yeah, if you look across the grid, I think Haas is the one where you look and you think, man, these guys, there's just been no progress this year, and that seems to have been the talking point for every other team. So, yeah, hard to really see where they go at this point, because now we've got the budget cap as well. The old excuse that Haas may have had in terms of the playing field is gone. They're competing, they are set up differently to other teams, but in terms of how much money others are spending compared to them, that's no longer the case. So you feel like this should be a time when they're thriving. And yeah, it felt like a year that I think from maybe race 5 or 6, when I was talking to people at the team, they were just like, yeah, this year's a write-off, which when a team's doing that early, it's always kind of red flag territory, I think. So yeah, I think out of all the seasons, and they had quite a fun driver lineup, I think. Laurence and I always joke, he's a Hulkenberg guy, I'm a Magnussen guy. And yeah, I thought that was quite an interesting driver lineup. 2 experienced guys, 2 guys obviously who we always joke about that beef that they had before, but who actually, I think, after years and years of struggling with rookie drivers, has finally had their head around the fact that, okay, we need experienced drivers here to lead us forward. And then they kind of produce a dud car. And, I think Hulkenberg did a good job with it through different points of the year. We didn't really see a huge amount from K-Mag, which was a shame because, I've always been a big fan of his. So yeah, I think, they really need to turn a corner next season. Otherwise it could just be another wasted season.
Yeah, I think Hulkenberg was the surprise maybe from Haas coming back, obviously such a long time away. His average qualifying position was just over 12.14, which is actually pretty good in a car like that. To talk about the issues that the team face as a whole and development wise, Gunter was talking about it in Abu Dhabi and basically said the problems were baked in from the very start, and some of the major issues they had with that car they couldn't unpick. So in trying to develop it aerodynamically, they're always on a bit of a losing kind of, they're always going to struggle to build it up. And of course, by the end of the year, they were running 2 different specs because one driver preferred one driver preferred the other. But they're optimistic things will get better for next year. Okay, guys, that wraps up our Unlapped season review of all 10 teams and a little bit more. But before we go, we need to get some predictions in place for 2024. Of course, it's way too early to make sensible predictions. So these are our bold predictions, intentionally out there for, our listeners' entertainment, essentially. Nate, let's start with you. What's your bold prediction for 2024?
Mine's quite an apocalyptic one. I'm not sure there's much entertainment to be had. I am going to say Max wins more races next year than he did this year. That's wow. I know 24? That's yeah. I think I don't 24 maybe is too many, but I just can't see the guy stopping winning. He's been so good. The car's in a great place, and that combination is as close to unbeatable as we've seen. So was it 19 this year? Yeah, he's got an extra race to win next year as well, hasn't he? Or 2 extra races? Is that right? It's 24 instead of 22. So yeah, that's like happy hour at the bar if you're Max Verstappen. There's so many chances. Sorry to everyone listening to that. I hope I'm wrong, but
Spencer, what have you got? Something a little bit more upbeat, maybe for people hoping for a competitive year in Formula One.
I'll make a very specific gossipy one, which is this: I think that the big money comes for Alex Albon, and that we try to get him poached at one point next year, and I think that will probably get sloppy and nasty, but I think that with that 2 spot at Red Bull looking wobbly, that the potential for some personnel chaos is there.
Nice. I like that. I think the driver market is probably going to be one of the highlights of next year. The potential for silly season to kick off in a whole new way next year as a number of driver contracts come to an end. Okay, my prediction, I'm going to balance out Nate and say that remarkably, Mercedes get it right. They go back to basics with everything. We know that they're scrapping a whole load of what they had on this year's car, and they feel that they've got something special for next year. I don't think it's going to happen immediately, but over the course of the year, it's going to ramp up, and you might see a situation where Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen again fight for a world championship. I don't know how likely that is, but I'm just putting it out there anyway. Anyway, well, thanks for listening to Unlapped. Those are our predictions. You have to wait and see whether any of them come true. Hopefully by the time we start next year, you will all have forgotten and we can make some new bold predictions that are entirely different. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the ESPN channel for more F1 content, and leave 5-star reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, thank you very much.